There is a moment when fear stops being a warning and starts becoming a ruler. It is subtle, almost polite. It doesn't arrive screaming, it arrives suggesting. It says, maybe not now. It says, what if this goes wrong? It says, wait until you're more prepared. And before you realize it, your decisions are no longer yours. They are negotiated, filtered, reduced. Life becomes smaller, not because you lack ability, but because fear has quietly taken control of the steering wheel. Most people believe fear is an emotion to be eliminated. That belief is the first mistake. Fear cannot be erased, and trying to erase it only strengthens it. Fear is not the enemy. Fear is information. The problem begins when information turns into authority, when a signal becomes a command, when a protective instinct becomes a governing force. If fear had a voice, it would not sound aggressive. It would sound reasonable. It would present evidence. It would show past failures, imagined futures and selective memories. It would argue with logic, or at least something that feels like logic. And this is why so many intelligent people are controlled by it. Not because they are weak, but because fear learned how to speak their language. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Fear gains control not because it is strong, but because your mind is untrained in how to process uncertainty. The human brain is designed to predict. It constantly builds models of what might happen next. When uncertainty increases, the brain fills the gap with simulations. Fear is simply one category of simulation, usually the loudest one. The question is not how to stop fear from appearing. The question is how to prevent fear from becoming the decision maker. The first technique begins with something that sounds almost too simple to matter, yet almost no one applies it correctly: separating fear from identity. Most people do not experience fear as an event. They experience it as a statement about who they are. I am afraid quickly becomes, I am not capable. A temporary signal becomes a permanent label. Fear is an output, not a definition. It is produced by your nervous system under specific conditions. Treating it as truth about yourself is a category error, the same as assuming a warning light is the engine itself. When the mind confuses signal with identity, it stops evaluating and starts obeying. To regain control, you must change the internal grammar of fear, not by suppressing it, but by renaming it. Instead of I am afraid, the correct internal statement is fear is present. This small linguistic shift creates distance. Distance creates choice, and choice is the foundation of control. This is not semantics. Language structures perception. When fear is framed as an external condition rather than an internal verdict, it loses its authority. You stop arguing with it. You stop trying to eliminate it. You simply acknowledge it as data. And here is the critical part. Fear does not require resolution to stop controlling you. It only requires classification. Once fear is categorized correctly, it no longer masquerades as a command. Most people wait for fear to disappear before acting. That is backwards. Fear rarely disappears before action. It recalibrates after action. Waiting trains the brain to associate fear with paralysis. Acting trains the brain to associate fear with survivability. This is why avoidance strengthens fear. Each avoided action teaches the nervous system that fear successfully prevented danger, even when no real danger existed. Over time, fear expands its territory. It begins to control not only risky decisions, but neutral ones. Eventually, even thinking about change triggers resistance. The first technique then is this: you do not ask fear for permission. You acknowledge its presence and proceed anyway within reason. You let fear ride along without giving it the wheel. If this resonates, pause for a moment and notice something subtle. How often do you delay not because you lack clarity, but because fear demands certainty first? That demand is the trap. Certainty is the reward of action, not its prerequisite. If this idea is landing for you, take a second to reflect on where fear has been quietly negotiating your choices. And share that realization in the comments. Naming it weakens it. Now comes the second technique, and this one requires even more honesty: restricting fear's time horizon. Fear feels overwhelming because it projects indefinitely. It doesn't scare you with one outcome. It scares you with an endless sequence of imagined consequences. The mind starts simulating not just failure, but failure multiplied by time. Embarrassment becomes permanent. One mistake becomes a lifelong identity. A single loss becomes an irreversible trajectory. This is computational overload. The brain is attempting to solve an infinite problem with finite resources. The result is paralysis. To prevent fear from assuming control, you must force it into a bounded window. Fear is manageable in small intervals. It becomes tyrannical when it is allowed to stretch endlessly into the future. The technique is simple, but again, rarely practiced. You decide actions in the smallest meaningful time unit possible. Not, will this work, but what is the next measurable step? Not, what if everything collapses, but what happens if I try this once? Fear feeds on abstraction. Action feeds on specificity. When you compress the timeline, fear loses its leverage. It can no longer threaten you with a lifetime of regret, only with a single step of discomfort. And discomfort is survivable. The nervous system knows this. It just needs evidence. Most people attempt to solve their entire future before taking the first step. That is not intelligence. It is avoidance disguised as planning. The brain convinces you that you are being responsible, when in reality you are postponing exposure. Control is regained when you replace hypothetical futures with immediate experiments. You are not committing to a destiny. You are running a test, and tests are not personal. They succeed or fail without redefining who you are. Here is a key insight most people miss. Fear escalates when outcomes are framed as permanent. It de-escalates when outcomes are framed as temporary. Your job is to frame every action as reversible whenever possible. Reversibility reduces perceived threat. Reduced threat restores agency. This is why fear dominates people who think in absolutes. If I fail, that's it. If I choose wrong, everything is ruined. These statements are rarely true, but fear depends on them. Remove permanence, and fear loses its argument. Notice how this changes your internal state. The body relaxes slightly. Breathing becomes easier. The mind regains flexibility. This is not confidence. This is control. And control does not come from eliminating fear. It comes from limiting its scope. If you've stayed with me this far, consider this. Fear does not need to be defeated. It needs to be outgrown. And outgrowing fear does not require bravery in the dramatic sense. It requires precision, clear language, short timelines, small deliberate actions. If this perspective is shifting how you understand your own fear, stay with it. Let it settle. And if you want to continue exploring how the mind can be trained to operate under uncertainty without collapsing into avoidance, make sure you remain here. What comes next builds directly on this foundation. Fear only controls those who treat it as absolute. Once you stop doing that, it becomes just another signal. Loud, yes, but no longer in charge. There is a critical misunderstanding that keeps fear alive long after the original threat has passed. Most people assume fear is produced by the situation itself. It is not. Fear is produced by interpretation. Two people can face the same uncertainty and experience completely different levels of fear. The difference is not courage, it is processing. Fear gains power when the mind treats imagined outcomes as if they were already real. The nervous system cannot distinguish clearly between a vividly imagined threat and an actual one. When imagination runs unchecked, the body reacts as if danger is present now. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, attention narrows. And once this state becomes familiar, the body starts entering it preemptively. This is how fear becomes automatic. To prevent fear from assuming control, you must intervene at the level where imagination turns into physiological command. This requires a shift most people resist, moving from emotional reasoning to structural reasoning. Fear asks, how does this feel? Control asks, how does this function? This distinction changes everything. When fear dominates, decisions are made based on anticipated emotional discomfort. When control is restored, decisions are made based on systems, constraints, and probabilities. You stop asking whether something feels safe and start asking whether it is structurally manageable. This is not emotional suppression. It is emotional containment. Here is what that looks like in practice. When fear arises, the untrained mind asks, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" The trained mind asks, "What system can contain this feeling while I act?" One question leads to avoidance. The other leads to agency. Fear becomes dangerous when it convinces you that action must wait for emotional calm. That condition is rarely met. Emotional calm is often the result of action, not its precursor. This leads to a simple but powerful internal rule. Feelings do not determine readiness. Structure does. If the action has boundaries, limits, and exit points, it is safe enough to attempt, even if fear is present. You do not need confidence. You need containment. This is where many people fail. They attempt to face fear with motivation. Motivation fluctuates. Structure holds. Think of fear like electrical current. Left uncontrolled, it shocks. Channeled correctly, it powers systems. Your goal is not to eliminate the current, but to wire it properly. This wiring happens through constraints. Constraints calm the nervous system because they limit exposure. When the mind knows there is a defined start, a defined end, and a defined cost, fear reduces automatically. Undefined exposure is what terrifies the brain. This is why vague goals increase anxiety and specific plans reduce it. "I need to change my life" is terrifying. "I will spend 30 minutes testing one option" is manageable. Notice the difference. One is infinite, the other is bounded. Fear thrives in infinity. Control lives in limits. Another overlooked mechanism of fear is its relationship with self-worth. Fear tightens its grip when outcomes are linked to identity. When success means "I am enough" and failure means "I am flawed," every decision becomes existential. The stakes skyrocket. Fear steps in to protect the self-image. This is why perfectionism and fear are inseparable. Perfectionism is not about high standards. It is about identity protection. Fear becomes the guard at the gate. To loosen this grip, outcomes must be decoupled from self-definition. Actions are experiments. Results are feedback. Neither defines who you are. This is not positive thinking. It is correct thinking. When you treat outcomes as data, fear loses its emotional leverage. Data can be analyzed without panic. Identity cannot. This shift is subtle but decisive. It transforms fear from a threat into a variable, and variables are manageable. There is also a social dimension to fear that rarely gets addressed. Many fears are not about failure itself, but about visibility, about being seen failing, about judgment, about loss of status. The human brain evolved in small groups where exclusion meant danger. Fear of judgment is ancient, but the modern environment amplifies it far beyond its usefulness. The mistake is treating imagined judgment as immediate threat. In reality, most people are far less focused on you than you assume. And even when judgment exists, it rarely has the consequences fear predicts. Fear exaggerates social cost because it assumes permanence. One moment of exposure becomes a lifelong label in the mind's simulation. Again, the antidote is limiting scope. Ask not, "What will people think?" Ask, "What is the realistic consequence of this specific action once?" When fear is forced to answer concretely, it often collapses. Fear depends on vagueness. Precision starves it. As you begin applying these techniques, something important happens. Fear stops feeling like a wall and starts feeling like friction. And friction is not a stop signal. It is a resistance signal. Resistance does not mean "do not proceed." It means proceed with awareness. This distinction matters. A system without resistance is unstable. A system with manageable resistance is functional. Fear, properly contained, sharpens attention. It improves preparation. It increases care. It only becomes destructive when it replaces judgment. The goal is not fearlessness. The goal is sovereignty. You are not meant to eliminate fear. You are meant to remain in charge when it appears. And here is the final insight most people never hear. Fear often intensifies right before growth, not because something is wrong, but because your nervous system is encountering unfamiliar territory. Novelty triggers uncertainty. Uncertainty triggers fear. This does not mean danger. It means expansion. If you interpret this correctly, fear becomes a signal of proximity to growth, not a warning to retreat. This reframing alone can change how you relate to hesitation. Instead of asking, "What if this goes wrong?" you ask, "What is this asking me to learn?" Learning is safer than judgment. Growth is safer than avoidance. And as this understanding settles, control quietly returns. You stop fighting fear. You stop obeying it. You start using it. If this way of thinking is clarifying something you've struggled to articulate before, let it anchor. Reflect on where fear has been treated as an authority instead of a signal. That awareness is the beginning of change. Stay present with this. The ability to act under uncertainty is not a personality trait. It is a trained capacity. And once trained, fear never disappears, but it never rules again. There is one more layer that determines whether fear remains a background signal or rises again to take control. It has nothing to do with courage, personality, or even past experiences. It has everything to do with repetition. The brain does not learn from insight alone. It learns from patterns, and fear survives wherever patterns reinforce it. Most people experience a moment of clarity about fear. They understand it intellectually. They even feel empowered briefly. Then, days later, fear returns with the same intensity. This leads to a dangerous conclusion. Nothing really changed. But something did change, just not enough times for the nervous system to update its expectations. Fear is predictive. It operates on memory, not logic. It predicts danger based on what has happened before, not on what makes sense now. If avoidance has been the dominant response in the past, fear predicts that avoidance is necessary for survival. No amount of reasoning overrides that prediction without new evidence. This is why the final technique is not conceptual. It is behavioral. Control over fear is consolidated through deliberate exposure to small, repeatable acts of non-avoidance. Not dramatic confrontations, not grand declarations, small proofs. The nervous system updates only when it experiences this sequence repeatedly. Fear appears, action still happens, and survival follows. One instance is not enough. The brain labels it as luck. 2 or 3 instances begin to form doubt. Repetition creates certainty. This is where most people sabotage themselves. They wait for fear to feel smaller before acting again. That delay resets the learning process. The brain forgets quickly when evidence is not reinforced. To prevent fear from regaining control, action must become boring, predictable, almost unremarkable. When action becomes routine, fear loses its narrative power. Fear thrives on drama. Routine starves it. This means you must design your actions so they are repeatable, not impressive. Consistency matters more than intensity. The goal is not to prove bravery. The goal is to retrain expectation. Ask yourself this: what is one action you could repeat weekly, even with fear present, that would slowly erode its authority? Not something that exhausts you, something sustainable. Fear collapses when it realizes it can no longer stop the behavior it was meant to prevent. There is also an internal discipline required here. Resisting the urge to analyze fear every time it appears. Over-analysis reactivates it. Observation without engagement weakens it. You note fear. You proceed. You do not negotiate. Negotiation implies power symmetry. Fear does not deserve that. Another subtle trap must be addressed: seeking reassurance. Reassurance temporarily soothes fear, but reinforces dependency. Each time you need reassurance before acting, you teach the brain that action is unsafe without external validation. Confidence is not built through reassurance. It is built through self-generated evidence. This is why fear often resurfaces stronger after periods of comfort. Comfort without challenge teaches the brain that safety exists only in stillness. When movement resumes, fear spikes. The solution is not constant discomfort. It is calibrated exposure. Enough to teach, not enough to overwhelm. When fear is calibrated correctly, it becomes quieter not because it vanished, but because it learned its place. There is a moment, usually unnoticed, when fear stops interrupting and starts observing. It still exists, but it no longer hijacks. That moment is the result of accumulated proof, and proof only comes from action. You may notice that fear never argues with outcomes. It argues with anticipation. Once something is done, fear has nothing left to say. This is why action silences fear more effectively than thought ever will. This leads to a final reframing that changes everything. Fear is not something you overcome once. It is something you update continuously. Each action updates the model. Each avoidance reinforces the old one. There is no neutral choice. If you reach this point, it means something in you recognizes this pattern. You have seen how fear negotiates, delays, exaggerates, and demands certainty. And you have also seen that control does not require fearlessness, only structure, limits, and repetition. Now the question is not whether fear will appear again. It will. The question is whether it will find the same environment it once ruled. Before you move on, pause and consider this carefully. What is one small action you have been postponing, not because you cannot do it, but because fear keeps asking for perfect conditions first? That is where your leverage is. If this reflection is landing, mark it, write it down, share it. Putting it into words transforms a vague pressure into a defined choice. Fear loses power when it is no longer allowed to remain abstract. Stay here. Let this settle. Control is not reclaimed through force. It is reclaimed through clarity, repetition, and restraint. And once reclaimed, it becomes stable. At some point, fear stops announcing itself loudly. It doesn't disappear, but it changes tone. It becomes quieter, more distant, less convincing. Not because life suddenly became safe, but because your mind stopped treating fear as a verdict. This is the stage most people never reach, because they mistake the absence of fear for success. In reality, success is the absence of obedience. What truly determines whether fear will ever take control again is not what you do when fear is intense, but how you behave when it is subtle. Strong fear is obvious. Subtle fear hides inside rationalizations, delays, and reasonable excuses. It doesn't say don't act, it says not yet. And that is where control is either maintained or quietly lost. The mind loves postponement because postponement feels safe. It creates the illusion of control without exposure. But postponement teaches the nervous system a dangerous lesson, that waiting is protection. Over time, fear no longer needs to shout. It only needs to whisper hesitation, and action stops. This is why the final consolidation of control requires one decisive internal rule. Hesitation is not a command. It is a signal to clarify, not to retreat. Most people respond to hesitation by stepping back. The trained response is to zoom in, to ask, what exactly is unclear? Fear dissolves when ambiguity is reduced. Clarity does not remove risk, but it removes distortion. When fear returns in a quieter form, the temptation is to believe it has become wisdom. That is the final trick. Fear often disguises itself as prudence, caution, or maturity, and sometimes it is those things. The difference lies in one question. Does this hesitation expand your options or shrink them? True prudence creates flexibility. Fear creates narrowing. If hesitation leads you to design better boundaries, better timing, or better preparation, it is functional. If it leads you to indefinite delay, it is fear regaining ground. This distinction requires honesty, and honesty is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. Another factor that determines whether fear reassumes control is internal trust, not confidence. Trust. Confidence is about outcomes. Trust is about process. When you trust that you can respond, adjust, and recover, fear loses its leverage. It no longer needs to prevent action because action is no longer framed as irreversible. People controlled by fear believe mistakes are permanent. People in control know mistakes are information. This mindset does not come from optimism. It comes from experience, from seeing yourself fail, adjust, and continue, from surviving discomfort without catastrophe, from discovering that fear's predictions are often exaggerated. And here is a crucial realization. Fear never tells you the whole story. It shows you worst-case fragments and hides neutral or positive outcomes. It is biased data. Treating biased data as absolute truth is a cognitive error. Control is restored when you insist on full information, when you acknowledge risk without amplifying it, when you refuse to let imagination outrun reality. At this stage, fear becomes predictable. You recognize its patterns. You know when it will appear, before exposure, before change, before visibility. That predictability strips it of mystery. And without mystery, fear loses much of its power. You no longer ask, "Why am I afraid?" You say, "Of course fear is here, this is new." And you proceed. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional literacy. And emotional literacy changes behavior quietly but permanently. You stop trying to feel brave. You stop trying to eliminate discomfort. You stop waiting for internal permission. You act with fear present and integrity intact. That is control. If you look back honestly, you will notice that the moments you regret most were not moments of fear, they were moments of avoidance. Fear hurts in the short term, avoidance costs in the long term. And the mind learns this only when the pattern is broken. Breaking the pattern does not require heroic acts, it requires consistency, precision, and respect for reality over imagination. Fear will still show up, it just won't be believed so easily. If this entire journey has clarified something you've struggled to articulate, if you now see fear not as an enemy, but as a signal that must be interpreted, limited, and contained, then anchor that understanding. Write it. Reflect on it. Share it with someone who lives under hesitation without realizing it. And if you want to continue developing this capacity, the ability to act under uncertainty without collapsing into avoidance, stay connected. The mind is not fixed. It is trained. And fear only rules where training is absent. You do not need to become fearless to live freely. You only need to remain in charge.